The translator wire in my ear was already burning before I sat down. That was the first sign something was wrong. The cochlear implant the council had fitted me with 3 months ago ran cool. Always cool, like a small whisper of technology that never raised its voice. That morning, sitting in the outer reception chamber of the Galactic Council's central hall on the moon they called Vel-Sorath, it burned like someone had pushed a coal against the side of my skull. I pressed 2 fingers to the spot behind my ear and told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things that morning that turned out to be wrong. My name is Yara Osei. I had spent 14 years in diplomatic service before the council came for us. I had negotiated ceasefire terms in 3 countries where people still wore weapons the way other people wore watches. I had sat across tables from men who would have had me removed from the room if I hadn't had 20 cameras pointed at them. I had learned very early that the most dangerous thing in any negotiation is the person who smiles like they have already won. Councillor Sainvo smiled exactly like that. He was the lead delegate of the Velhari Consensus, which was the polite name for the oldest and most powerful voting bloc in the Galactic Council. The Velhari had been traveling between stars when humans were still arguing about whether the planet was flat. They were tall, gray-skinned, and moved with the kind of slow patience that comes from living 300 years on average. Senvo specifically had the eyes of someone who had watched entire civilizations make decisions and then quietly watched those decisions end them. He smiled at me from across the chamber floor, and I felt the translator wire burn a little hotter. The Galactic Council had 47 member species. Humanity had been admitted 8 months ago, which was, by council standards, approximately 15 minutes ago. We were new, we were young, and we had been given a seat at the table not because anyone respected us, but because the Velhari Consensus had needed a 47th vote to break a deadlock with the Orun Coalition over deep space mineral rights. We were a convenience. We were a tiebreaker with a flag and a heartbeat. I knew this going in. The Secretary General had been very clear about it in my briefing. They don't want a partner, she had said, leaning across her desk in Geneva, with her hands flat on the table, like she was trying to hold the planet still. They want a rubber stamp that can shake hands. Your job is to make sure that rubber stamp develops opinions before they notice. I had developed opinions. The problem was, so had they. The emergency session I had requested had been granted with suspicious speed. That was the second sign. When powerful people agree to your requests quickly and without argument, they are not being generous. They are setting something up. I had learned that in Nairobi, in 2031, when a government minister granted my team access to records we had been requesting for 2 years, all at once, without conditions, 2 days before an election. The records turned out to be curated. The cooperation had been a trap. I sat down in the human delegation's chair, a chair that had been specially constructed to fit a human spine, which was one of the few genuine courtesies the council had extended, and I opened the briefing file on the panel in front of me. The peace framework of the Galactic Council was 912 pages long. It covered trade routes, border protocols, non-aggression agreements, environmental standards for inhabited systems, and approximately 40 pages on the proper way to address a delegate whose species communicated through bioluminescent skin patterns rather than sound. It was, by almost any measure, a thorough document. My legal team on Earth had found Clause 7 on page 441. It was written in the kind of language that makes lawyers age visibly. Dense, technical, full of redirections to subclauses and footnotes and definitions that themselves redirected to other definitions. My team had spent 3 days untangling it, and when they were done, the lead analyst, a quiet man named Patrick who never used more words than he needed, had sent me a single message. It read, "They can take whatever they want from us and call it legal." Clause 7 says any council majority can invoke emergency resource authority over any member species' territory, infrastructure, or population data for the purpose of collective galactic stability. They've used it 31 times. Always on species that couldn't say no. I had read that message 4 times. Then I had put my coffee down, walked to the window of my quarters on Vel-Sorath, and looked out at the stars. There were more stars visible from that moon than I had ever seen from Earth. Thousands and thousands of them, cold and ancient, and completely indifferent. I had gone back to my desk and started preparing for the session. The chamber filled slowly. Delegates arrived in their own ways. Some walked, some rolled. Some moved in environmental suits filled with atmosphere their species required. The Seleni arrived last, as they always did, their translucent bodies barely visible against the chamber light. They found their seats without making a sound. They never made sounds. Communication for the Selene was a matter of pressure and light, and the translator wire in my ear reduced it all to a flat, even voice that sounded, for reasons no one had ever explained to me, like a radio broadcaster from the 1950s. I watched Senvo settle into his chair. He had 3 other Velhari delegates with him, all of them wearing the same expression of comfortable authority. One of them, a younger delegate named Velran, was looking at me with something that was not quite curiosity, and not quite contempt. It was more like the look you give a piece of furniture you are about to move. The session was called to order by the presiding voice. A rotating title held this cycle by a delegate from the Drath Compact. The Drath were small and brown and moved their hands constantly when they spoke, as if they were always conducting something invisible. The presiding voice was a Drath named Kor Aleth, and she was one of the 3 delegates who had quietly contacted my office in the past 48 hours. I had not expected that. When I was preparing for the session, going through the history of Clause 7, I had reached out to the 3 smallest member species to ask if they had ever experienced a Clause 7 invocation against them. I had expected silence or polite deflections. Instead, Kor Aleth had replied within an hour, with a document of her own, a record of 9 separate Clause 7 actions against Drath territory over the past 160 years. Each one had been framed as a collective emergency. Each one had reduced Drath autonomy by a measurable degree. She had ended her message with 7 words. We did not think anyone would ask. I thought about those 7 words while the chamber settled and the formal proceedings began. There was a species of power that worked entirely through the assumption that no one would bother to look. It was not new. Humans had invented that particular trick long before we ever looked at the stars. We had also, eventually, invented the habit of looking anyway. The session formally opened. Sain Vo rose to address the chamber. He was going to table a motion, he said, a routine matter of resource coordination. He spoke slowly, with the measured confidence of a man who expected the outcome before the question was asked. The translator wire translated his long, smooth sentences into clean English in my ear. Around the chamber, 46 other species were hearing 46 other translations of the same words, all of them calibrated to their own languages and idioms. He spoke for 11 minutes. He said the word stability 14 times. He said the word cooperation 9 times. He never once said the word humans, but by the 4th minute, every delegate in that chamber knew exactly who he was talking about. I kept my hands flat on the desk in front of me. I kept my face neutral. I watched him speak and I thought about Patrick's message, and I thought about Kor Aleth's 7 words, and I thought about the Secretary General's instructions, which had been updated overnight with 3 additional lines added at the bottom in her own handwriting, scanned and transmitted by secure relay. The 3 additional lines read, "Do not threaten. Do not plead. Do not ask for anything. Show them what we decided. Then come home." I had read those lines 6 times. I had them memorized. I kept them at the front of my mind, while Sain Vo sat back down, and the presiding voice looked in my direction, and asked if the human delegation wished to respond before the motion was tabled. I stood up. The chamber was never truly quiet. There were always the sounds of environmental systems, of delegates shifting in their seats, of the soft hum of translation equipment running constantly in the background. But when I stood, something changed in the quality of the noise. It became a listening quiet. 46 species, representing thousands of years of collective history, turned their attention to the newest delegate in the room. I looked at Sen Vo. He was still smiling. I pressed the button on my panel that activated the display screen behind me. A single document appeared on it. Not Clause 7, not the peace framework, not a legal brief. It was a map. A map of Earth, surrounded by the neat boundaries of its solar system, with a single red marker over every location the Council had flagged as a priority resource zone in their internal planning documents, copies of which Patrick's team had found embedded in the treaty appendices that nobody had thought to encrypt. There were 42 red markers on that map. 31 of them were oceans. I waited for the chamber to understand what it was looking at. It took about 4 seconds. Then I began to speak. The night before the session, I had not slept. I had sat at the small desk in my quarters with a cup of tea that went cold, and a data pad full of everything my team had compiled in 72 hours of continuous work, and I had written out what I was going to say. Not in formal diplomatic language. Not in the careful, cushioned phrasing that had kept me employed for 14 years. In plain, clear sentences that left no room for reinterpretation. I had written it in English first, then sent it to the translation team to be rendered into the 8 most common council languages, so that every delegate who wanted to understand exactly what I meant could do so without relying on a wire. I started with facts. The peace framework had been in operation for 412 years. In that time, Clause 7 had been invoked 31 times. I named each invocation. I named the species it had been used against. I named the specific resources extracted or controlled as a result. I named the Velhari consensus as the initiating party in 28 of the 31 cases. I put all of it on the screen behind me, line by line, in a format that any species with the ability to read numbers could follow. I did not raise my voice. I did not pause for effect. I spoke the way Patrick wrote, with no more words than the facts required. The chamber was completely still by the time I reached the 14th invocation. By the 22nd, 2 of the Velhari junior delegates had stopped looking at their own panels and were looking at each other. Senvo had stopped smiling. I finished the historical record and moved to the present case without stopping. The Council's internal planning documents, which my team had accessed through the treaty appendices, which had been attached to the peace framework and were therefore legally accessible to all member delegations, which nobody in 8 months of human membership had apparently told us to look at, contained detailed assessments of Earth's hydrological systems. The word used to classify Earth's oceans in those documents was not a diplomatic word. It was a logistics word, the kind used in shipping manifests and supply chain breakdowns. I read that word aloud, in the original Velhari, without translation. I wanted the Velhari delegates to hear their own language used in that context in front of 46 other species. Velron, the young Velhari delegate who had been looking at me like furniture, looked away. Sanvo's expression did not change, but his hands moved on the desk in front of him, and I had spent enough time watching him to know that when his hands moved, he was recalculating. I continued. The Clause 7 action the Velhari consensus intended to bring against humanity was not a response to any emergency. There was no galactic crisis that required Earth's oceans. There was no shortage of water in Council-controlled space. I cited 6 separate hydrological surveys published by the Council's own scientific committees in the past 30 years. The action was not emergency response. It was resource acquisition, under cover of legal framework. It was, in plain language, taking. The peace framework, I said, was designed to protect the stability of all member species, not to provide a legal instrument for the strong to take from the new. If that is what this body has become, then this body is not what it presented itself to be, and humanity's decision about how to respond to that was made before I walked into this chamber. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed a sealed document card. I held it up so the chamber cameras could record it clearly. Then I slid it across the desk to the presiding voice. Cor Aleth, the Drath who was serving as presiding voice, picked it up. Her hands were moving in their constant conducting motion, more rapidly than usual. She pressed the card to the chamber reader. The document appeared on every screen in the chamber simultaneously. It was brief. The language was straightforward. It had been drafted by the combined legal teams of every government on Earth, reviewed by every head of state, and signed by all of them within a 20-hour window that had required 17 emergency sessions on Earth's side, 6 of which had taken place in the middle of the night for someone. It read, in full, "The people of Earth, acting through the unanimous agreement of their recognized governing bodies, hereby withdraw from the Galactic Council, effective at the moment of this document's submission, without condition, without appeal, and without negotiation under the current framework. We thank the Council for the opportunity, and wish its members stability in all things. We will find our own." I watched the chamber read it. Then I picked up my diplomatic badge from the desk, a small thing, copper-colored, with the Earth symbol on one side and the Council seal on the other. and I placed it carefully face down on the panel in front of me. I turned toward the exit. Behind me, the chamber erupted. Every translation wire in 46 ears fired at once, as 46 species began reacting in 46 different ways. I heard fragments, disbelief, confusion, anger in several registers, something from the Sileni end of the chamber that the translator rendered as a sustained note of profound surprise. I heard Senvo's voice cut through it, measured and sharp, calling for order, and then calling for me to stop, and then calling for a recess. I kept walking. The corridor outside the chamber was empty. My footsteps echoed on the polished stone floor, and the translator wire in my ear, no longer connected to the chamber's network, had gone completely silent. For the first time in 3 months, my ear did not burn. I walked to the end of the corridor, where a large window looked out over the surface of Velsorath, and beyond it to the black sky full of stars. I stopped there for a moment, not for effect. Nobody was watching. I stopped because my legs had decided they needed a moment, and after everything, I thought they had earned it. I looked at the stars. Then I kept walking. The shuttle back to the orbital station took 40 minutes. I spent 35 of them writing a report to the Secretary General, and 5 of them staring at the ceiling, which was the correct ratio for a day like that one. The report was honest. I wrote what had happened, what I had said, what I had seen on Senvo's face when the withdrawal document appeared on the screens, and what I had seen on Kor Aleth's face, which was something I had not expected and could not fully name. It was not relief, exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has just been told they are allowed to exhale. The Secretary General's response came before the shuttle docked. It was 3 words: "Come home, Yara." I sat with that for a while. Home, as it turned out, was about to become considerably more complicated. The orbital station above Velsorath had 12 species represented in its transit population at any given time. When I arrived, I walked through the main transit hall with my bag over my shoulder and my empty lapel where the badge had been, and people, creatures, stopped to look at me. Not all of them, but enough. I heard the word for human in at least 4 languages as I passed, and the tones ranged from curious to impressed to something that in the Drath language, according to Patrick, who had sent me a vocabulary brief that I had not asked for but was grateful for, meant roughly, the one who did the unexpected thing. At the transit counter, a young Drath official processed my departure without a word, but as she handed back my travel document, she pressed her 3 small fingers briefly to her chest, and then extended them toward me. I had read enough by then to know what that gesture meant. It was a Drath acknowledgement, old, formal, used between equals. I pressed my own hand to my chest and extended it back. I had no idea if I was doing it correctly. She blinked both sets of eyelids in a way that suggested I was close enough. I boarded the transit shuttle to the relay point and fell asleep for the first time in 31 hours. On Earth, things were moving. I learned this in pieces, through updates that arrived in my message queue over the 40-hour journey home. The withdrawal had been public, the Council's sessions were recorded, and the records distributed to all member species as a matter of protocol, which meant that a document with humanity's signature on it, withdrawing from the Council in plain language, had been transmitted across a significant portion of known space within hours of the session ending. The reaction had been, to use a word I would use a great deal in the weeks that followed, varied. Several Council species had issued formal statements expressing concern. 2 species had issued statements that my team assessed as quiet approval, dressed in diplomatic language. The Orun Coalition, which had been in a long dispute with the Velhari Consensus over the mineral rights issue that had originally prompted humanity's invitation to the Council, had said nothing at all, which Patrick noted was very loud silence. The Velhari Consensus had issued a strongly worded statement, calling the withdrawal a violation of treaty obligations. Earth's legal team responded within 6 hours with a 40-page brief explaining, in detail, that the withdrawal was entirely within the rights of member species under Section 2 of the Peace Framework's own foundational charter, and that the Velhari Consensus was welcome to bring a counterclaim before the Council's arbitration body, at which point Earth would note that it was no longer subject to that body's jurisdiction. The brief ended with a short paragraph that was technically polite, and in practice something else entirely. I read it on the shuttle, and decided I was very glad Patrick worked for us. Back home, the public reaction had been, again, varied, but trending in a direction that surprised some commentators, and surprised nobody who had spent time talking to ordinary people in ordinary places. The street-level response, as captured by every media feed I had access to, was not panic. It was not fear. It was, in a large number of cases, a kind of grim, satisfied energy. The energy of a population that had spent 8 months being told their planet had been admitted to a great galactic partnership, and had just learned the partnership had been looking at their oceans as supply inventory. Human beings, as I have observed over my entire career, are capable of many things. One of the things they are particularly capable of is getting extremely focused when someone tells them they are not going to be treated fairly. The Secretary General had convened an emergency session of the Reformed Earth Coordination Council, a body created specifically to manage the relationship with galactic civilizations, within hours of the withdrawal document being submitted. I was not present for that session. I was in a shuttle, but the minutes were in my queue, and I read them with the same feeling you get when you read a very good thriller novel, and you cannot put it down even though you have been awake for too long. The session had lasted 9 hours. By the end of it, 3 things had been decided. First, Earth would not re-enter the Galactic Council under any existing terms, not any. The peace framework, as currently written, was not something humanity would sign again. If a new framework was developed that did not contain Clause 7, or any provision like it, discussions could begin. Second, the technology licensing agreements humanity had signed as part of Council membership were to be reviewed. Specifically, the FTL relay technology that Earth had been granted access to under a licensing arrangement, an arrangement that, upon review, contained provisions that were arguably voided by the Council's own breach of foundational treaty principles, was to be studied, replicated, and developed independently. The legal argument for this was complex. Patrick's team had prepared a 48-page summary. The short version was, they broke the deal first. Third, Earth would reach out, quietly and through private channels, to the 3 species that had contacted my office before the session, the Drath, the Orun, and the Selene, not to form an alliance, not to build a counter-coalition, just to ask how they were doing and whether they wanted to talk. It was the third decision that I thought was the most important, but then, I had always been better at the conversations that started with listening. I arrived home on a Tuesday morning. The Secretary General met me at the transit facility herself, which was unusual. She was a small, brisk woman named Adaize Nwofor, who had been running international coordination for 7 years, and who had the habit of communicating vast amounts of information with very few words. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Sainvo has requested a private communication channel." I raised an eyebrow. "He says it is personal, not official." I thought about that. What does he want? He hasn't said. He just asked if you were willing to listen. I picked up my bag. "Tell him I'll think about it." She nodded, and we walked toward the building, and outside the sun was very bright, and the air smelled like rain had fallen recently, and I realized I had not smelled rain in 3 months. I stopped walking for a second, just for a second. Then I kept going. 6 months after I walked out of the Galactic Council chamber, I was sitting in a cafe in Accra watching 3 different news feeds on a tablet, eating a meal I had been meaning to eat for approximately a year, and thinking about how strange it was that the most consequential thing I had ever done had felt, in the moment, so quiet. No explosion, no dramatic final word, just a badge placed face down on a desk and footsteps in an empty corridor. The news feeds were, as usual, full of things that the Council had not expected. Feed 1. The Drath Compact had formally suspended its participation in the Peace Framework's Resource Allocation Committee, citing what it called unresolved questions about the impartiality of the arbitration process. They had not withdrawn. They were not withdrawing. They were just not participating in that specific committee, which happened to be the committee that Clause 7 actions were processed through. Our participation in a committee you had not left was, it turned out, optional. Feed 2. A group of 12 independent research institutions across 5 council species had jointly published a review of all 31 Clause 7 invocations. The review had not been commissioned by anyone. The researchers had simply decided, after the events of the session, that the historical record deserved to be complete. The review was thorough, sourced, and, according to every assessment I had seen, accurate. It had been downloaded over 4 million times in the first week. Feed 3. The Orun Coalition had proposed, through formal channels, the establishment of an independent interspecies economic coordination body, separate from the Council, with no permanent members, operating on rotating authority. The proposal was 9 pages long. 4 of those pages contained language that my team recognized because they had helped draft it. After a very long conversation with an Orun liaison named Vel Thrix, who communicated entirely through written messages and had the most precise prose style I had ever encountered in any species. The Council had responded to the Orun proposal by calling it premature. The Orun had responded by noting that they had not asked the Council's opinion. I finished my meal and looked out at the street. A woman was walking past with a child who could not have been more than 6 years old. The child was looking up at the sky the way children do when something catches their attention up there. A cloud shape, a bird, something invisible to everyone but them. The woman said something to the child, and the child pointed upward more insistently, and the woman looked up too. I could not hear what they were saying. The street was noisy and they were too far away, but I watched the woman's expression change from mild impatience to something softer as she looked at whatever the child was pointing at. She said something else. The child grabbed her hand. They kept walking. I put some money on the table and picked up my tablet and walked outside. Patrick had sent me a message that morning. It was, as always, direct. The Council's arbitration body has formally logged a counterclaim against Earth's use of the relay technology. They are arguing breach of contract. Our legal team's response is ready. Do you want to read it before they send it? I typed back, "Is it good?" He replied, "It's devastating." I typed, "Send it." Then I walked back toward my office, which was technically my kitchen table, where I had set up 3 monitors and a secure relay terminal, and a perpetually full coffee maker that my colleague Nina had given me as a homecoming present, with a note that said, "You're going to need this," in handwriting so small I had needed to use a magnifying app. Nina had been right. The Velhari Consensus had sent 3 separate requests for a negotiation session in the past 6 months. The first 2 had been routed through official council channels and received official non-responses from Earth's Coordination Office. The third had arrived through the private channel Sen Vo had requested, the one I had told the Secretary General I would think about. I had been thinking about it. I had been thinking about the 31 invocations. I had been thinking about Kor Aelith's 7 words. I had been thinking about the young Drath official at the transit counter, and her 2-handed gesture. I had been thinking about what it means to walk away from something, and what that walk changes, and whether change is the same as progress, and what the difference is between a door closing and a door being built. The private channel request sat in my queue, unanswered, for 4 months and 3 weeks. I answered it on a Wednesday afternoon, because that was when I decided I had finished thinking. I wrote 3 sentences. I am willing to listen. I am not willing to negotiate under the current framework. If you have something new to say it. The response came back in 40 minutes, which for a Velhari, a species whose average internal deliberation on any response of consequence lasted several days, was the rough equivalent of a human being answering before the question had finished being asked. Sen Vo wrote 11 words. The framework may need to change. I did not expect you. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote back, most people don't. The second time I entered the Galactic Council chamber, I was not an ambassador. My credentials, submitted 8 days before the session that would become the most referenced meeting in modern council history, listed my role as independent facilitator, representing no government and no bloc, present at the invitation of 7 member species, who had jointly requested that a neutral party assist in the discussion of proposed amendments to the Peace Framework's foundational charter. 7 species. Not 2, not 3. 7. The Drath Compact, the Orun Coalition, the Silen Collective. 3 smaller species I had not interacted with directly before but who had sent careful, precise messages through Patrick's secure relay over the previous 3 months, and 1 species that nobody had expected. a mid-tier member of the Velhari Consensus's own associated bloc, a species called the Vareth, who had been quietly affiliated with Velhari interests for 2 centuries, and who had, apparently, decided that the word quietly had begun to describe something they no longer wanted to be. The Vareth delegate had contacted my office 6 weeks earlier. Her name was Solen Var, and she communicated in a fast, clipped style that reminded me of certain news editors I had worked with early in my career, people who had decided that efficiency of language was a virtue and never changed their minds about it. She had written, "The Vareth have observed the past 8 months. We have also observed the past 2 centuries. We have questions. Are you someone who answers questions?" I had written back, "Depends on the question." She had written, "Is there a version of this framework that works for everyone?" I had written, "I don't know, but I think that's the right question." That had apparently been sufficient, because 3 days later, she had submitted the Vareth's formal request to participate in the proposed amendment discussion, breaking from the Velhari bloc for the first time in recorded council history. Sainvo had not commented publicly, but Patrick, who had a gift for reading diplomatic signals the way some people read weather patterns, had noted that 3 separate Velhari internal communications, all technically public record under council transparency rules, had referenced the concept of recalibration within the same 48-hour window. "They're going to come to the table," Patrick had told me. "Everyone comes to the table eventually," I said. "You didn't," he said. "I came back to a different table." He had considered that. Fair. The chamber looked different from where I was sitting. The facilitator's position was not at the human delegation's desk, which was empty, but at a neutral lectern near the center of the floor. I could see every delegation from there. I could see Sanvo at the Velhari desk, flanked by the same 3 delegates as always, but with the young one, Velron, visibly absent. I could see Kor Aleth at the Drath desk, her hands moving in their constant conducting rhythm. I could see Solen Var at a desk that had been moved, at her request, slightly away from the Velhari section, a small distance, but visible. I had been in enough rooms to know that small distances are rarely small. The session was called to order. The agenda had 1 item, a vote on the proposed amendment to the peace framework that would permanently remove Clause 7 from the document, replace it with a new provision establishing an independent review board for any collective resource action, require unanimous consent rather than simple majority for any action affecting a member species' home territory, and mandate the publication of all future resource assessment documents as a condition of membership. The amendment had been drafted over 6 weeks by a joint team that included 2 Drath lawyers, 1 Orun policy architect, 3 human legal specialists including Patrick, and Solen Var, who had contributed a single paragraph to the preamble that was, by consensus, the clearest thing in the entire document. The paragraph read, "A framework for peace is not a mechanism for control. It is a shared agreement between equals, who accept that being equal does not mean being identical, and that the strength of any agreement is not found in what it allows the powerful to do, but in what it prevents anyone from doing to the small." I had read that paragraph the first time Patrick sent it to me, and I had not been able to argue with a single word of it. The vote took 11 minutes. In council history, 11 minutes for a vote of this magnitude was the equivalent of instant. There were normally days of procedural deliberation, caucuses, private channel negotiations, amendments to the amendment, counter-proposals, and at least 1 species requesting additional time to consult with its home government. 11 minutes meant that most of the deciding had already been done before anyone walked into the room. The result was 41-2. Both dissenting votes were from Velhari proxies whose names I did not recognize, and who, based on their body language when the result was announced, had perhaps not received the same internal memo as Sainvo. Clause 7 was struck from the peace framework of the Galactic Council. The chamber did not erupt this time. It was quieter. The Silene end of the chamber produced a low, sustained pressure that the translator rendered as something close to, "This is how it was supposed to be." The Drath Compact's desks filled with the sound of conducting hands moving in faster rhythms. Kor Aleth looked across the chamber floor at me and pressed her fingers to her chest and extended them outward. I returned the gesture. Better this time. She blinked. The second item, which had not been on the formal agenda but had been agreed to in the preliminary discussions, was a motion to initiate a formal audit of all 31 historical Clause 7 invocations, with findings to be published in the Council's public record and recommendations for reparative measures to be developed over the following 3 years. That vote took 7 minutes. 39-4. Sane Vo voted in favor. I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice something small and specific in the middle of a very large event, not because it changes everything, but because it means something was shifting at a level that was harder to legislate. He had voted in favor not because he was compelled to. He had voted in favor because something in the 8 months of watching the Council slow to a crawl without the smaller species, something in the Varith's movement, something in Selen Var's preamble paragraph, had moved the needle by some small but real amount. I did not forgive him the 31 invocations. That was not my forgiveness to give, but I noted the vote. After the session, in the corridor outside the chamber, the same corridor I had walked alone 8 months ago, footsteps echoing, translator wire gone silent, San Vo found me. He was alone, which was unusual for him. He stood in front of me and said nothing for a moment. In Velhari culture, silence at the beginning of a direct interaction was not awkward. It was considered honest, a signal that what was about to be said had not been rehearsed. He said, "You were the first delegation in Council history to invoke a withdrawal before a countervote." "I know," I said. "We believed you would return within 60 days. I know that too." He was quiet for another moment. "What we did not expect," he said, "was that you would make it so that returning was unnecessary." I looked at him. "The audit is going to take 3 years. Yes, and the reparative measures will take longer than that. Almost certainly. And Clause 7 is gone, but there are 11 other provisions in the framework that deserve the same review." He seemed to measure that. "One thing at a time." "That's what we thought you'd say," I said. "So we've already started on the next 11. He looked at me with those 300-year-old eyes, and something passed across his face that was not quite the smile from the first session. It was something quieter, more considered. "You are a very inconvenient species," he said. "Thank you," I said. "We've been working on it for a while." I walked back toward the transit area. Behind me, the corridor was not empty this time. Selen Var was standing with Kor Aelith, near the chamber entrance, and their gestures back and forth had the quality of two people discovering they have more in common than they expected. Near the window at the end of the corridor, the same window where I had stopped 8 months ago to look at the stars, a young Velhari delegate I did not recognize was looking out at Vel Sorath's black sky, looking up the way people look when they are thinking about something larger than the room they are standing in. I did not stop at the window this time. I already knew what was out there. On the shuttle home, I wrote the last line of my report to the Secretary General. The report was long, 63 pages, which was short by my previous standards but felt about right for a day that had moved as fast as this one. The last line took me a while. Not because I did not know what I wanted to say, because I wanted to say it correctly. I wrote, "We did not walk away from peace. We walked away from a room that had decided peace was something it owned. There is a difference. It has always been the difference. And if the past 8 months have shown anything, it is that the species who understand that distinction, the ones who have learned it the hard way, across generations, on a planet that gave them no easy answers, are exactly the species the galaxy needs in that room. Not because we are the strongest, not because we are the oldest, but because we are the ones who remember, in our bones, what it costs when the room gets it wrong." I read it back once. Then I sent it, closed the pad, leaned my head back, and listened to the sound of a shuttle moving through space, through the cold and the dark and the enormous indifferent distance between one small blue world and everything else. Somewhere out there, 41 species had just voted to make something better. That was, I thought, a decent Tuesday.